Hi, my name is Andrea Morsek-Grazzini. I want to share my thoughts on racial healing, and particularly between whites and blacks in the United States. I want to first start by acknowledging that this remains a huge issue in our culture and country now, even years after the Emancipation Proclamation and even years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is when I was born, 51 years ago. Those laws moved us forward in structural ways, somewhat, but we didn't change in internal ways. We were able to fix some external problems by changing the way that blacks were finally seen as humans and treated with human rights, or at least with laws that would suggest that they had equal access to human rights and equal respect for human rights. But as a people, we haven't changed in many, many ways. Some of those, I think, in the South, where I don't live, are pretty poignant and pretty in your face. In the North, where I do live, they are no less damaging in my mind, and they're no less present. I grew up in a upper middle class family in Minnesota, known as a liberal state. I grew up, as I said, in 1964 during the height of the civil rights movement. Hubert Humphrey, who was one of the leaders of civil rights legislation, hails from my state. We were very proud of his work, as did others. So we have some demonstrated rhetoric and meaningful outcomes related to race in my state. And yet, my state, particularly the Twin Cities, remains, if not the highest, one of the highest in racial disparities in the United States. How does that happen? How can that happen? Shouldn't that be something that happens in the South? How can it happen in a good state like mine with buildings and streets named after Hubert H. Humphrey, who was a huge advocate of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Not an advocate, but an agent for and with it. And Walter Mondale and many others. It's a proof of inequities, of racial inequities in my state. And yet proofs, I think, are one way to look at it, and I think we can't ignore those. But people is the more important way to look at it. You know, who are we as people? Do we see each other? Do we see blacks? Do we hear them? If we see them in our neighborhoods, which we do now in Minnesota, we do have, in my community of Burnsville, we have great diversity. And yet, the inequities are clear even in my children's schools, which are good schools. These are not the schools that struggle like the rest of the country. Why? So I grew up in a upper middle class family with a racist father who was still prone to saying the odd nasty about people of color. And yet my best friend for many years as a child was a person of color. She was East Indian. Her parents were both immigrants. I knew it wasn't that I didn't know she was East Indian, but it didn't click for me as a child. And even into my early adulthood, she shared my same interest. We had the same energies, the same goals in many ways. And that's what I saw. So I think as a child and children, we often do see the person and can ignore the color of their skin. I'm not an advocate for ignoring the color of people's skin. If I were black, I would hope I'd be proud of the color of my skin and the many stunningly amazing leaders that have led not only blacks, but our whole world in so many important ways. And I'd also be proud of my culture. of a culture of strong women and of a deep spirituality, whether it's religious or not, a resilience against stunning odds, an ability to be angry, but also to be loving at the same time, which is what I see in a lot of my Black friends. This friend of mine who's East Indian brought it home for me, and maybe nobody else could have done it quite as well. I went to visit her. She was going to law school at Georgetown in DC, and I was still up here in Minnesota, and I went to visit her during law school and spent time with her. And we were at it was a bookstore in Foggy Bottom. Both of us were interested in civics and politics, and it was kind of a cool place for us to go and have a drink and look at books, which is a favorite pastime for us both. And it was late, and I'm not sure what I said or what our discussion was about. But for the first time that I can remember in my friendship with her, she was angry with me. And she was angry because I didn't see her reality. We grew up in the same white suburb. We had families that were similar. Mine was Italian, hers was Indian. And so, kind of boisterous families and, really tight families and bossy families and good people and all that. And a lot of cooking in both houses. Theirs smelled a little bit different than ours did, but nonetheless. So again, I knew that she was a different color than me and my family and the kids that we went to school with, but it just didn't register because all I cared about was her heart, like any good, liberal, compassionate person does, right? I was proud of, well, I don't know if I was proud of myself then. She was just my friend. But I might have been. I think my family was. They used to call her my Indian friend. It used to make me cringe. Although even when it made me cringe, I didn't fully understand even why. I just never had been intentional about seeing things through her eyes. We were talking about Blacks. And at some point, she said, I can really relate. And I said, but you're not Black. And she said, but I'm a person of color. And the fact that you don't see that is the problem. You don't see me as different. You want to pretend like I'm just like you. And I did. I don't know if there's anything more egotistical or narcissistic than that. I did see us as alike. We wanted to save the world. We wanted to do all these things. We talked about philosophy and humanity and all the. So it never occurred to me to differentiate between us two. But here she was telling me, I'm not you. You didn't experience what I experienced at the very same schools that you and I went to together as BFFs for years. You didn't see it. And it was happening all the time. And you never saw it. Didn't you see when so-and-so would talk down to me? Or didn't you see when such and such would, make a racist comment in front of me, not realizing that that might hurt me? Didn't you see, or didn't you realize how I might feel a little bit different? Because my parents had a picture of an Indian saint in their house, and everyone else's parents had a cross in their house. You didn't see it, and you didn't recognize how outcast I felt and how differently I was treated, even though you were my best friend. And I didn't. That's our problem. We don't see. We have to see. Negotiate. All I could think of was they would be far more. We have a problem in this country around police officers. And to those who know me and be sisters. If we are good, start showing our dignity.